Okay, so in week 4, our fourth time meeting, we're going to look at the skeletal system. We're going to look at the organization of it and then look at the microscopic build of bone. So I'm going to divide those up into 2 videos. So in this video, we're going to look at how the skeletal system's organized. One of the things you'll find about scientists is they're very anal about everything. Everything has to be sorted, grouped, categorized, and organized. And so the skeletal system is no different. So we're going to look at some examples of bones in how they are organized. Now this picture shows 5 different types of bones. The bones are going to be categorized in these 5 types: long bones, short bones, flat bones, irregular bones, and sesamoid bones. Now on this, it's going to show the bones that would be used. I'll tell you more about that in a couple other slides, but let's look at what the picture in the book had. So this is the picture in the book, and in this one, they are going to include sesamoid bones as a part of short bones. Some people do that. For us right now, I want you to think of this as its own separate category. All right, so that's why it makes 5. On this, there's only 4. So long bones. Long bones are going to be the bones that we are going to use to study the makeup of bones. The most famous long bone, the bone that I would probably use as the prime example, is this one here, which you will learn as the femur. It is the one as it's shown here that's going to be kind of the hip bone, or the leg bone, the upper thigh bone, basically. I was going to make a joke about the hip bone connected to the leg bone, but it didn't work out well. So anyway, long bones are known by a long, hardened middle shaft with expanded ends. And now I just want to say that long is a very relative term. When we get into the hand, you'll see that some of the bones that make up the fingers that are called phalanges, they're also long bones, but the bones aren't long the way you and I would think of. But the femur is the longest and strongest bone in the body, and so it would be the example I would use. The next one is going to be short bones. Short bones are going to be kind of pebble-ish. They're cube-like, it says here. The area that I would use to show the short bones are going to be bones that we would commonly call carpals. Right? In the wrist, there are 8 little bones here on each hand called carpals, and that would be my classic example of a short bone. These sesamoid bones, they're pretty weird. Sesamoid bones are bones, basically what they are calcium deposits within tendons, and the most common place you're going to see them is the hands and the feet. If you've ever seen x-rays, any of those little white calcium deposits are considered a sesamoid bone. But we all share one sesamoid bone in common. That sesamoid bone that we share is this little weird biscuit-looking bone right here, and it is the kneecap. It is called the patella. The patella is the one sesamoid bone we all share in common. When we look at the muscles, I'm going to kind of use that as to explain a few things, but the patella, which is commonly called the kneecap, is a calcium deposit, a bone that gets embedded in the tendon that's holding on to your quadriceps. Right? So those 3 right now hopefully make sense. Long bones, classic examples: the femur, long middle shaft, expanded ends. Short bones, we're using the carpals. They're kind of cube-like. Sesamoid bone, the only one we share in common is the patella. And so we get to the last 2. The first one we look at is called a flat bone. Now, I would imagine that before I even say anything, you know what a flat bone's characteristic look would be. And if you said flat, you are correct. Now, on the picture that we looked at a minute ago with the bone models, it had the scapula, the bone that's right, back here on the back part of your shoulder. But for me, I would use the one it uses here, and it is a cranial bone. You'll see cranial bones or flat bones, the bones that make up this cranial cavity. They're your noggin, so to speak. Those are flat bones, but you know the scapula is one too as well. So flat bones in general are going to be flat. And then finally, the last one, which is what I think most everybody would think every bone is called an irregular bone. Irregular bones just have bizarre shapes. They're really going to be found in two main areas. One of them is going to be in the bones of the face, so the bones that don't make up the cranial cavity. But the one that I would probably say to use, since I'm a chiropractor, are going to be vertebrae. And this is the one that they choose here. The vertebrae here are going to be examples of irregular bones. And again, I think as a student, most of us would probably think all bones are irregular bones because they're all pretty weird. So now we look at the parts of a long bone, because again, these are the things that we'll need to look at and know how to identify. So again, this is a femur. And so the first thing is understanding the two different parts that we talked about. The hardened middle shaft is called a diaphysis. The expanded ends are called epiphysis. And so in the skeletal system, you can see they've got a distal and proximal epiphysis here. Remember, when we looked at those directional terms in the arms and legs, the thing closer to, for instance, in the leg, the thing closer to the hip is proximal, and the part that's farther away from the hip is called distal. So that's where they get. We're not really going to talk about the metaphysis here. That is going to represent the general area where you would probably see what we would commonly call the growth plate, but that's not necessarily the case. It's really just an area of transition between the diaphysis and epiphysis. Now, one of the big things about the diaphysis and epiphysis, and I'll just kind of go through here and do my little checks for things to know. You don't have to know the metaphysis. One of the big things is that there are two types of bone that make up all bone: compact bone and spongy bone. You don't have to know their true scientific name of it. But compact bone is where all the bony material is very compact, and spongy bone is where it's all spread out and kind of looks like sponge. You can kind of see it here. I'm not enlarging it right now, but if I could, you would see that part in there looks like a sponge. Now, most of the body, the bones are going to be made up of a combination of both compact and spongy bone, and long bones are a good example of this. In the diaphysis, it is mostly compact bone, but there is a thin ring, there's a hollow opening here called the medullary cavity. There's a thin ring of spongy bone around the medullary cavity, but it's mainly compact bone. But as it gets closer to the epiphysis, you'll see that the compact bone will start thinning out and the spongy bone starts taking over. So in the epiphysis, there's going to be more spongy bone than compact bone. So that's kind of how it's all divided up. All right, hopefully that makes sense. As we go through, hopefully you'll see it even clearer. So as we get to the epiphysis, again, we're going to have mostly spongy bone on this with a layer of compact bone around it. The areas where the joints are going to be, where the bone is going to actually articulate with something else, and the word articulation means a joint in the body. It's where two bones rub together. And where that is, you're going to have cartilage that remains, and this is called articular cartilage. And what this really is this bone first starts out as a hyaline cartilage model, and as it changes to bone, there's going to be a leftover remnant of that cartilage, and it ends up being articular cartilage. And so here you can see on the femur, on this, these are the two condyles of the knee. They're going to be covered in articular cartilage. If you've ever bitten into a chicken drumstick and got that nasty white piece of cartilage on the top, that's what you bit into. Right? Now, the bone itself is going to be covered in a very thick outer covering, a very tough, I shouldn't say thick, a very tough, strong outer covering called periosteum. The periosteum covers the bone entirely, and it is a very good connective tissue covering that helps protect it. So the periosteum. Then finally, I shouldn't say finally, then we have what's called the medullary cavity. Inside of here, we have this hollow opening. It's where you're going to find yellow bone marrow. All right, we're going to talk about the two types of bone marrow here in just a second, but this is where you'll find yellow bone marrow. Yellow bone marrow is kind of a storage area for a lot of fats and different minerals, electrolytes, if you want to say. And so that medullary cavity, like I said, is going to house the bone marrow. Now, we're going to look also at a different type of bone marrow called red bone marrow in a minute. But the medullary cavity, while it has this little inner lining of spongy bone, that spongy bone is going to be lined with another covering called endosteum. So it is the counterpart of this periosteum. So periosteum is on the outside of bone, and endosteum is on the inside of the medullary cavity. Now, endosteum is not a term that's on your student handouts, but I do want you to have that in the back of your head. I will tell you in lab, I won't ask it, but it becomes kind of important when you see how the bone grows. So just want to point that out. Now, the last couple here, this trabeculae and then the red bone marrow, these are both associated with the spongy bone. All right, so like it says here, all of this in here, and this arrow not only points to this, it's kind of pointing to all of this area inside the epiphysis is called spongy bone. So in spongy bone, let's say if I'm not enlarging it, but if I took a cross section and you'd see that there's these little bone webs, little plates that are extending all through the bone and across, and across and all over. And those webs, kind of like if you were thinking of a spider web, that little layer of bone is called trabeculae. And what trabeculae means is web-like. And so if you imagine taking a cross-section of a sponge, it's got all of these little hollow areas in it. Where the actual sponge is would be equivalent to where the bone is, and those little webs, the little areas of sponge or bone, is called trabeculae. Now, inside the spongy bone, you are going to find a very important material called red bone marrow. Red bone marrow is vitally important. This is where your blood stem cells are located. If you've ever heard of someone having a bone marrow transplant, this is what they're trying to get. That person is having a problem creating blood cells, and so they need to get someone who also has a healthy red bone marrow and put it into that body so they can make red blood cells, or blood cells in general. All blood cells. So in blood, you have red blood cells. Now I'm going to try and RBC, all right, which is the majority of them. About 95% of all the cells in blood are red blood cells. They're carrying oxygen and all that stuff. And then you have white blood cells, WBCs. These are also called leukocytes, and there's 5 types of them. And then you have thrombocytes, which are platelets, and I'll just kind of put this TH. They are the little fragments. Every one of them originate from the same stem cell. All right, so the red bone marrow has the stem cell, which is the parent for all of the blood cells, and so it's vitally important. So those are the parts of this long bone. Now, if we're looking at a femur, this is a picture of the femur from the school. You will see that it is divided up into the two main parts on this. The epiphysis on either end, proximal and distal, and then the diaphysis in the middle. Now, right now, you don't know what's proximal and distal. When we study the bones, you'll see how they fit together like a jigsaw puzzle, and so you would need to know proximal and distal epiphysis. So that's the organization kind of the bones themselves. Now, when they are grouped together and form the skeleton, there's another organization, but it's pretty simple. It's the axial skeleton versus the appendicular skeleton. The axial skeleton is going to be the skull, the vertebral column, vertebrae, with its sacrum, and the rib cage. The appendicular skeleton are the arms and legs, and they're what we call girdles, or the parts, the specialized bones that hold those arms and legs onto the axial skeleton. So we've got axial skeleton and appendicular skeleton. So that's the organization of the skeletal system.